Story number 1. There's a theory I heard once that still keeps me up at night, and it's not even one of those grand, world-altering conspiracies. No, it's about something that hits much closer to home, about how our devices are always listening. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, the kind of thing people joke about when their phones show ads for something they swear they only mentioned in passing. But then, I experienced it myself, and it left me with a feeling I just can't shake. It started innocently enough. One afternoon, I was talking to my friend Emily about this new brand of cat food I was thinking of trying. It wasn't a big conversation, just a quick passing mention of how my cat was getting picky, and I'd seen an ad for this premium stuff that promised to make even the fussiest cat happy. That was it. I didn't Google it, didn't search for it online, just a casual conversation in my living room, my phone sitting on the coffee table nearby. Later that evening, I was scrolling through Instagram when the ads started popping up. You know the kind I'm talking about, the ones that seem way too specific. But this time, it wasn't just a coincidence. Every single ad was for that exact brand of cat food. The same packaging, the same tagline, everything. I froze. My first thought was that it had to be some weird fluke, that maybe I had Googled it at some point and just didn't remember. But I checked my search history. Nothing. I hadn't typed it into my phone, hadn't clicked on anything related to it. The only place I'd ever mentioned it was out loud to Emily. That's when I started thinking back to all the other times this had happened. Those weird moments when my phone seemed to know what I wanted before I did. New shoes I'd been thinking about buying. A vacation destination I'd casually mentioned. Even random household items I'd talked about while hanging out with friends. All of them showing up in my feed like my phone had been eavesdropping the entire time. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't just the ads. There were times when I'd been mid-conversation, and my phone's voice assistant would randomly chime in, even though I hadn't said its trigger word. At the time, I'd laughed it off, thinking it was just a glitch, but now I wasn't so sure. Was my phone listening to everything? And if it was, what else was it picking up? I started digging into the idea that our phones and devices are always listening, not just for voice commands, but for everything we say. I found article after article about how apps request microphone access, how voice assistants are constantly on standby, waiting for a trigger word. And that's when I stumbled across something even more disturbing. The theory that this information isn't just used for ads, but for something bigger. According to the conspiracy, tech companies are gathering massive amounts of data, more than we could ever imagine, using our phones, smart speakers, and even our TVs to listen in on our conversations. This data isn't just about selling us products. The theory goes deeper, suggesting that governments and corporations are working together, using this information to profile us, predict our behavior, and control what we see, hear, and even think. It's all done under the guise of convenience, personalized ads, better recommendations, but in reality, it's about control. The more I read, the more I started to feel like I was being watched, like every word I said was being cataloged, analyzed, and used against me. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but once you start noticing how often it happens, you can't unsee it. Every time my phone buzzed with a new ad or suggestion, I felt a chill run down my spine. The worst part is, I couldn't escape it. Everywhere I went, my phone was with me. Even turning off the microphone access didn't seem to help. I'd hear stories of people who'd done the same thing, only to still see those eerily targeted ads. It was like the machines had become so deeply embedded in our lives that there was no getting away from them. I started to feel paranoid, like I couldn't trust my own devices. I even began leaving my phone in a different room when I had private conversations, but it didn't help. The ads kept coming, and the feeling of being constantly monitored never went away. It was like the walls had ears, and no matter how hard I tried to stay off the grid, I was always being pulled back in. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that your every word, every thought, is being turned into data that's being sold, traded, and used to manipulate you without your knowledge. It's not just about selling cat food anymore. It's about how much power we've given away without even realizing it. I still use my phone, of course. I haven't thrown it out the window or gone full tinfoil hat, but every time I see an ad that's a little too on point, I wonder how much of my life is truly private and how much of it is being silently recorded and used by forces I'll never fully understand. Story number 2. There's a theory I came across once, something I hadn't thought much about until it hit too close to home. It's the idea that when people vanish, completely disappear without a trace. It's not always just a random accident or foul play. Sometimes, it's something much more sinister. I didn't really believe in any of that at first. I mean, people go missing, sure, but there's always an explanation, right? Except when it happens to someone you know, and there's no explanation at all. It was 2 years ago when my friend Ryan disappeared. We'd been best friends since high school, inseparable really. We didn't talk every day once we got older, but we always stayed in touch. Ryan was one of those people who loved being outdoors, hiking, camping, exploring. It was his thing. So, when he decided to take a solo hiking trip up north, I wasn't surprised. He'd done it a dozen times before. What could go wrong? The plan was simple. He'd spend a few days hiking through a national park, camp out, then come back to town for a beer and to catch up. He texted me the night before he left, saying he was stoked for the trip and that he'd see me when he got back. But he never came back. At first, I thought he'd just lost service or decided to extend his trip. That was Ryan. He'd go off the grid for a while and come back with stories about the wild. But days passed, and I didn't hear anything. His family started to worry, and eventually, they called the park rangers to check his last known location. When they found his campsite, everything was untouched: his tent, his gear, even his food. It was like he had just walked away and never came back. No signs of a struggle, no tracks leading anywhere, just gone. The official search went on for weeks. They sent out teams with dogs, helicopters, everything, but they found nothing. No body, no clues, nothing to suggest what had happened to him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The authorities chalked it up to a freak accident. Maybe he'd gotten lost or hurt himself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. That's when I started reading about these disappearances. People going missing in national parks, remote forests, or wilderness areas without a single trace left behind. Hundreds, maybe thousands of cases. The more I read, the stranger it all seemed. These weren't just ordinary missing persons cases. In many of them, people's belongings were left in pristine condition, just like Ryan's. Some of the bodies that were found were miles away from where they'd disappeared, in areas that didn't make sense, sometimes places they couldn't have reached on foot. Then I came across the theory, the one that really got under my skin. It suggests that something is out there in the wilderness. Not animals, not human predators, something else. Something ancient, powerful, and capable of taking people without a trace. The stories range from creatures, to hidden underground societies, to portals that open up in certain areas of the world, swallowing people whole. It sounds insane, right? Like the plot of a bad sci-fi movie. But after what happened to Ryan, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there's something to it. I kept digging, obsessing over the details. Some say the government knows about it but covers it up, labeling these disappearances as unexplained or natural accidents to avoid panic. There are theories that certain parts of the wilderness are marked as no-go zones, places where people vanish without warning. The park rangers never talk about it, but if you look hard enough, you'll find stories from those who've worked in national parks, warning people to stay away from certain trails, certain mountains, certain valleys. The weird part? Many of these places line up with areas where people like Ryan have disappeared. I went back to where Ryan's campsite had been. I know it sounds crazy, but I needed answers. I retraced his steps, hiked the same trail, even camped out for a night in the exact spot where they'd found his gear. I didn't really expect to find anything, but I hoped maybe I'd feel something, some connection, some clue as to what had happened to him. The night I spent there was the eeriest of my life. I don't scare easily, but that night, I felt watched. The forest was too quiet. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. It was like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't sleep much. Every little noise sent my heart racing, and even though I didn't see anything, I felt it. The same feeling you get when someone's standing behind you, just out of sight. When I left the next morning, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe Ryan hadn't gotten lost. Maybe he hadn't had an accident. Maybe he'd walked too far into one of those places you're not supposed to go. A place where things happen. I still don't know what to believe. The rational part of me wants to write it off as a tragic accident, a freak occurrence that can't be explained. But there's another part of me, the part that can't let go of the strange circumstances, the unexplained details, the eerie quiet of that forest, that believes something took him, something that hides in the wilderness, waiting for people to wander too far. And the scariest part? If it could happen to Ryan, it could happen to anyone. Story number 3. I didn't used to believe in much beyond what I could see. The whole idea of shadow governments or secret societies pulling the strings from behind the scenes always seemed like something out of a bad thriller. But then I started hearing whispers about a group so hidden, so powerful, that most people don't even know they exist. They call themselves the Architects, and the deeper I dug into their existence, the more I wished I hadn't. It started with a job offer, one that seemed way too good to be true. I was fresh out of college, struggling to find work in my field. One day I got this email from a company I'd never heard of, some sort of high-end consulting firm. They said they'd seen my resume and were interested in bringing me on for a special project. They were vague on the details, but the salary they were offering, it was almost double what I'd expected for an entry-level position. And they didn't ask for an interview, just a brief online form, a personality assessment, and that was it. Something about it felt off. No one gets hired this easily, right? But I was desperate, and the money was too good to pass up. So I filled out the forms and sent them back, figuring I'd see where it led. The next day, I got a call. It wasn't even from a recruiter, just some guy who said his name was Mr. Gray. No first name, just Gray. "Congratulations," he said, his voice smooth and professional, but with this undertone that gave me chills. "We'd like to bring you in. You'll be working on something very important. Report to the address in the email tomorrow. Do not be late." I remember looking at the email again, my stomach tightening. The address wasn't in any part of town I was familiar with. It was in some industrial district, off the beaten path. But the company's website looked legit. There was nothing overtly suspicious, but something about Mr. Gray's voice stuck with me, like he knew more than he was letting on. The next day, I made my way to the address, and the moment I pulled up, the feeling in my gut told me I shouldn't be there. The building was nondescript, just a gray windowless structure with no signage. I almost turned around, but the curiosity, the need to know what was really going on, got the better of me. So, I went in. Inside, everything was stark and minimalist. No reception desk, no employees milling about, just white walls, dim lighting, and an elevator at the far end of the room. There was no directory, no explanation of where to go, but somehow, I knew I was supposed to take the elevator. I pressed the button, and the door slid open immediately, like it had been waiting for me. The elevator didn't stop at any floors. It just went down, deep underground. I lost track of how many levels we passed. It was unsettling, the feeling of being pulled further and further into something I didn't understand. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a long hallway. At the end of it stood Mr. Gray. He greeted me with a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He led me into a room that looked like a conference center, with sleek furniture and a massive screen mounted on the wall. There were others in the room, men and women, all dressed in sharp black suits. They barely glanced at me, their expressions unreadable. "Welcome," Mr. Gray said, standing at the head of the table. "You've been selected for a very specific reason. We control the future. The world doesn't know we exist, but we are the ones who shape what happens next." I laughed, thinking it was some elaborate corporate metaphor, but no one else laughed. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. Gray continued, explaining how their organization, the Architects, had their hands in everything: politics, finance, even technological advancements. They claimed to decide which governments would rise and fall, which innovations would succeed or fail, and even which wars would be fought, all in the name of maintaining balance. I tried to play along, nodding as if I understood, but inside, I was starting to panic. This wasn't just a consulting job. This was something darker, something far beyond what I'd signed up for. And the worst part? They made it clear that once you were in, there was no leaving. Mr. Gray handed me a folder filled with documents I couldn't understand. Charts, graphs, codes, plans for something massive. "You'll start by reviewing this," he said, his tone casual, like he was asking me to go over a spreadsheet. "Then we'll move you up to more sensitive material." I don't remember much after that. I was in a haze, too stunned to process what was happening. By the time I left the building, I was numb. I drove home in silence, the folder still clutched in my hand, wondering what the hell I had just walked into. I never went back. I quit the job the next day, told them I wasn't interested anymore. But it wasn't that easy. They kept calling. Emails flooded my inbox. I blocked every number, every email address, but they always found a way to reach me. And then the real fear set in. People started watching me. I'd see the same car parked outside my apartment at night, the same man standing across the street from my office during the day. Whenever I left the house, I felt eyes on me. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was all in my head, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then, one night, I found a note slipped under my door. No signature, no explanation, just 4 words, scrawled in neat black ink. You can't escape us. That's when I left the city. I packed up everything I could fit in my car and moved across the country, changed my number, deleted all my social media accounts. I disappeared as best as I could, but sometimes I still see them. A car that follows me a little too long. A man in a suit standing just a bit too still on the corner. I know they're still out there, watching. And no matter how far I run, I'll never be free of them. Story number 4. I used to laugh at conspiracy theories. You know, the usual stuff. Aliens, Bigfoot, shadow governments. They all seem too far-fetched, too ridiculous to be true. But there's one theory that I heard a few years back that still gives me chills. And not just because of what it says, but because of what I saw. The theory is simple. Not everyone you see is human. Some people, maybe even people you know, aren't people at all. There's something else, something hiding in plain sight. I first heard about it from my friend Mark. He'd gone deep into conspiracy forums, and at first, I thought it was just one of those internet rabbit holes he was falling down. He told me about the others, as he called them. Beings that look human, act human, but aren't. They blend in perfectly, but they have a different agenda. No one knows where they come from or why they're here. Some say they're alien. Others think they're some sort of advanced AI. But the point is, they're here, living among us. I rolled my eyes and told him he'd been watching too much late-night TV. Come on, man, you really think there's a secret race of people hiding in plain sight? I asked. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with this strange intensity and said, "One day, you'll see." And I did. It happened about 6 months after that conversation. I hadn't thought much about it since, chalking it up to another one of Mark's wild theories. But one night, I was coming home late from work. It was around 2 a.m., and my neighborhood was dead silent. You know that kind of eerie stillness that feels unnatural? Yeah, that's how it was. No cars on the street, no people around. Just me and the cold night air. As I pulled up to my apartment building, I saw someone standing on the sidewalk across the street. A woman. She was standing completely still, staring straight ahead, not moving an inch. At first, I thought she was just waiting for a ride, or maybe having a smoke break, but something about her posture caught my attention. It was too rigid, too unnatural. I parked my car and watched her for a second, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Then she did something that froze me in place. Without warning, she turned her head, not her body, just her head, slowly, like a machine, and looked directly at me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold run through my body. I can't explain it, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They looked human, sure, but there was nothing behind them. No emotion, no recognition, just empty blank stares. She held my gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly, she turned her head back and resumed her statue-like stillness, staring straight ahead again. I should have just gone inside. I should have brushed it off as some weird encounter, maybe just someone high or drunk. But my curiosity got the better of me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, so I decided to walk closer, just to see if I could figure out what her deal was. As I crossed the street, she didn't move, not an inch. I could hear the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the empty street, but she stayed perfectly still. When I was about 10 feet away, I stopped. That's when I noticed something else, her breathing, or rather, her lack of it. She wasn't breathing, not even shallow breaths, just nothing. My stomach dropped. Something was very, very wrong. I turned to leave, to head back to my apartment and forget the whole thing. But before I could take another step, she moved. Not like a normal person. She moved in a quick, jerky motion, her body swiveling toward me like a mannequin being turned on a display stand. Her face was blank, her eyes still hollow, but her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like she was trying to figure me out. And then she spoke. "Are you one of us?" Her voice wasn't right. It was too flat, too mechanical. It didn't match the way she looked. I stood there paralyzed, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't answer, couldn't move. I just stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. After a few seconds, she repeated the question, "Are you one of us?" I backed away, my mind racing, trying to process what she was asking. One of us? What did that even mean? I didn't wait to find out. I turned and bolted, running back across the street and up to my apartment, my heart slamming against my ribcage the entire time. I locked the door behind me and stood there, panting, trying to catch my breath. When I finally worked up the nerve to look outside again, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I kept going over what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just a strange encounter with someone who wasn't all there. But deep down, I knew better. The next day I called Mark. I told him everything about the woman, the way she moved, the questions she asked. He didn't sound surprised. He just said, "I told you, they're everywhere. You just haven't been paying attention." Since that night, I've started paying attention, and I'm noticing things I never saw before. People who don't quite fit in, who move or act in ways that seem off. I don't know what they are or what they want, but they're out there, watching, waiting. And now I know that Mark was right. Not everyone you see is human.